You're right, I absolutely love this bit. Ah, well, back to work, I suppose. It's some more riddles you'll be wanting. Why do you think a local vicar who was passionate about a heartless queen who was struck by lightning why do you think he'd get all cross when a bunch of road menders dug up his Christmas roses? The queen in question is this lady, Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I. Now, she died near Lincoln, and it was ordered that her corpse should be carried back to London, a 12-day winter journey. The famous Eleanor crosses were later built to mark the resting places along the way. Of the 12, only 3 are left, and the best by far is at Geddington, near Kettering. Edward built these crosses here in the heart of the English countryside, so that there'd always be a lasting memorial to the yearnings of his own heart, the yearnings at the loss of his beloved Eleanor. What you see in these crosses is a rare glimpse behind the mask of medieval kingship, a chance to see the man that lay beyond the monarch. I don't think so. Think about this. Edward was everything that a medieval king should be. He was hard-headed, top-of-the-range, thoroughgoing hardcase. This was not a man given to fond romantic gestures, and certainly not splurging his ill feelings all over the English countryside so that his subjects could go, "Oh, poor King Edward." That was not his style. What these crosses are political statements. They are statements of the power and the stability of Edward's regime. That's why he was happy to cough up part of the cost. Oh, didn't I mention that? Edward didn't pay for the crosses. Eleanor did. You see, no one ever mentions that most of the money came from the late Queen's estate. And something else that's often tactfully overlooked are the travel arrangements. Right. Now, suppose you're wondering all about our heartless Queen, surely not our Eleanor. Well, in a way it was. This bit is all about royal post-mortem rituals. You see, when the great and the good shuffled off their mortal coil, sometimes they very selfishly and very inconsiderately popped their clogs in a place way out in the back of beyond, which left somebody else with the enormous problem of how to get the royal body back to a place that was suitable for a regal burial. Now, if you were faced with a long journey in order to do that, well, believe me, if you didn't want your royal bod to start to swell and smell, you were well advised to take yourself off somewhere nice and quiet and discreet and begin the process of evisceration, gently disemboweling your nearest and dearest recently departed, and then parceling up all their various bits and bobs in a nice neat fashion and delivering them into the care of a nearby monastery. In Ellie's case, it was Lincoln Cathedral. Thank you very much, Your Grace. Really is a great help. We'll send you the money for a nice shiny new shrine in a year or two. Thank you. And of course, once you'd done that, you then began the process, just as I thought, tapeworm. You then began the process of taking her heart out. Ooh. Eleanor's heart was taken and placed with great reverence into a reliquary, a carved and gilded reliquary in the shape of an angel, which was then given into the care of the Dominicans at the Blackfriars in London. Now this shocked, not to say surprised, an awful lot of people, because Eleanor of Castile was known to be a lifelong Frank Sinatra fan. And they naturally assumed that this would have gone to the Franciscans. You know, like in the song. I left my heart with some Franciscans high on a hill in a monastery. cross at Stamford had originally stood in the Foxdale area of the town, but it was smashed to bits by Protestant extremists in the 1540s, who thought that statues and crucifixes were idolatrous and superstitious. Now, the vicar of Stamford was really struck by the story of the Eleanor Crosses. Luckily, that was all he was struck by. And what about the lightning in the riddle? Well, that's our local vicar. You see, when he was a lad of 14, he went off to see the remains of Waltham Cross, the Eleanor Cross that had been blown to smithereens by a lightning strike. And being a scholarly and a serious sort of chap, he decided to write it up in great detail and with beautiful little diagrams to accompany it, all for the sake of posterity. Which is no surprise, really, because he grew up to be one of the great antiquarians of his age, the Reverend William Stukely, a man who had a great passion for digging into, and sometimes even digging up the past. William Stukely was an antiquarian, you know, enthusiastic bods who are fascinated by the past. He lived in Stamford for 18 years, and he made the most of its archaeological opportunities. And one Christmas, the vicar really got lucky. The Turnpike Trust were quarrying an area outside the town. You remember from the other programme, they used to dig up the stone and use it to repair the local roads. Now, the surveyor on that job, probably a chum of Stukely's, knew that William, for ages, had been absolutely desperate to go poking round in an area known as the Queen's Mound. He was convinced it was a Saxon burial mound. Well, he couldn't get there fast enough. And what he found there, well, turned out to be probably the best Christmas present William Stukely ever had. He found the remains of Stamford's Eleanor Cross, and he took bits of it back and used them as a garden ornament. Except that's not his house, it's up here. Stukely was in the forefront of the 18th century fashion for decorating your garden with archaeological remains. He put in a Romanesque plaque honouring the doctor who treated his gout. He had favourite poetry carved in stone, and somewhere in this garden he placed his treasured fragment of Eleanor's cross. Do we know where he actually put that?
In his diary, when he left the town, he said, "I left it in my hermitage." Now, his hermitage was a confection sort of somewhere in this garden around here. I'm not absolutely certain where it was.
Unhappily, long after he'd moved away from Stamford, the fragment was lost. Until museum curator John Smith was invited by Julia Walker to take a look at some foundations in the garden of the old vicarage.
While we were in the house afterwards, Julia's mother came along and said, "Have you seen my roses?" And the world stopped. And I thought, roses? Stukely, Eleanor Cross, Stukely's description. And she brought this fragment of this stone in, and I thought, oh gosh, this is it. The discovery of my life. This is a fragment of the Stamford Eleanor Cross, wow, because it fitted exactly Stukely's description.
How did you know that what you had in your hand was the Eleanor Cross?
Stukely specifically describes it as adorned with roses. 'Tis of the Sussex marble. Well, in the 18th century, Sussex marble was always confused with Purbeck marble, and this was adorned with roses. It was made of Purbeck marble, and it was found on only what could have been an excavation which discovered the Eleanor Cross. Nothing else of that size could have existed at that point in the town.
And why did you get so excited by that?
Oh, it's the only part of an Eleanor Cross shaft which exists in the world. None of all the rest have disappeared. Quite clearly, what we have is what Stukely drew, or a part of what he drew.
Why do you think someone who'd been a right royal bastard in their youth, how did they progress to spending half their midsummer evenings away with the fairies, dancing and frolicking? And why would a hugely popular band have done a Royal Command rooftop gig long before these lads climbed on top of the Apple building to do their farewell performance? Now, our second royal journey takes place in the summer of 1578, a time when the county gentry flocked to Norwich in all their finery to welcome their queen to Norfolk. Is that riddle coming any clearer yet? I can see I'm going to have to do the first bit for you. The political fallout from Henry VIII's numerous marriages meant that his daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, spent most of her green years as the illegitimate offspring of an illegitimate marriage, Nan Boleyn's royal bastard. Of course, when she became Queen Elizabeth I, nobody in their right mind mentioned that sort of thing. But how did she progress from that to enjoying her midsummer evenings away with the fairies? Well, and a special feature of her reign was the Royal Summer Progress, a terrifically theatrical, stunningly spectacular royal tour of the provinces, when she and all of her courtiers upped sticks, abandoned the palaces in London, and set out on a tour of the countryside. It took meticulous planning to get the court's huge and unwieldy baggage train through Essex and Suffolk and up to Norwich in easy stages. When the Lord Mayor and his chums rode out to meet her at Harford Bridge, they were determined to show Her Majesty that the second city in the realm could put on a first-class show. Because they knew that the Queen had a penchant for pretty boys, they brought with them 60 of the county's most handsome bachelors, who were attired in the Queen's personal colours: black satin doublet, probably, I guess, white breeches, that was the usual form, and hats of yellow and purple satin. Not my taste exactly, a bit gaudy, but then who am I to talk about loud colours? The point was, it made the right impression on the Queen. The royal entourage entered the city, and ploughing slowly through the surging, shouting crowds, they headed for the cathedral. Now, the Dean and Chapter hadn't exactly broken open the piggy bank, but they'd done their bit. Newly painted corporate logos, that's royal coats of arms to me and thee, they were prominently displayed to welcome the head of the English Church. I've lost count of the number of times I've visited Norwich Cathedral, but there's always something new to see, isn't there? The verger's just pointed this out to me. That, me dears, is a musket ball. Why is it there? Well, just after the Civil War, Roundhead troopers were billeted here in the cathedral. The place was almost derelict, but while they were here, they spent their spare time when they'd been on the booze using statues and walls and floors for target practice. Why ever come here, though? Not just to look at the musket ball. No. This whole area was where the Queen sat throughout the service that she attended. Must have been pretty nerve-wracking if you think about it, for the Dean and Chapter having the boss looking at what you're up to from so close up. But she sat here in a specially built throne. We know this because the accounts of the cathedral list the expenditure on having this new creation for the Queen to sit in. It was a canopied affair and had a little prayer stool in front, and the whole thing was tricked out in red damask, red velvet, scarlet satin, and beautiful scarlet lace to edge the whole thing. It sounds absolutely frightful, if you ask me. My guess is that the Queen was well pleased with it all, which meant that the Dean and Chapter probably thought it was well worth the expense. She must have heaved a sigh of relief when, official duties over, she could retire to the privacy of her lodgings in the Bishop's Palace, through the Bishop's private gates. So when all the welcoming ceremonies were over, this is where she came. She rode down here.
This is where she would have finished up to spend the night.
That's the Bishop's Gate.
Tired out.
So this is where she clattered through.
Absolutely right, and by the look of it, the very same gates Looking at the woodwork and the ironwork, all contemporary.
I was going to say they're contemporaneous, aren't they?
Absolutely, yes. When she came through the gate, she'd have seen an enormous formal hall where the bishop held all his public occasions and rejoicings.
So this is the remains of it here?
All that is left, actually, is that porch.
But even here there was no rest. From a palace window that's now part of Norwich School, she had to enjoy yet more exciting entertainments. So, Paul, this is the very window. Well, obviously not because it's a modern window, but this is where she stood.
This is almost certainly the right place, absolutely. No doubt about that.
What did she see? What was she looking at?
Well, she'd been looking out onto a graveyard, really. It was the green yard, an enormous area with a cross in the middle, where people used to come for sermons and whatnot, and it would have been absolutely full of those sort of people who'd come to see a spectacle.
I was going to say, what did they entertain her with, but I suspect it was what did she have to endure that afternoon?
Well, that afternoon she'd have seen a pageant that had been put on by Norwich people, by the citizens, people dressed up as Cupid and Mercury and all sorts of things, lots of music, lots of singing, and probably lots of instrumental noise.
The question I have to ask, because there's so many places in Norwich that say Queen Elizabeth slept here on her visit, but of course she didn't, did she? She was here the whole time.
She was at the palace all the time, being entertained by the bishop. I suppose because it was perhaps one of the most comfortable places in Norwich she could stay, because the castle was pretty rickety at that stage, and this had been sorted out by Bishop Freak when he first came, so it was probably fairly comfortable.
Do you think he was pleased to have her here?
Very hard to tell. I think he was a rather grumpy chap, Bishop Freak. I think he'd have been honoured rather than pleased.
So much for the royal progress. Rooftop gig? Well, as her nibs made her way through the wildly cheering mob, up on the roof of the Guildhall in their scarlet gowns and gold chains of office, the Norwich waits were waiting. And now, in the middle of all these junketings that welcomed the Queen into the heart of the city, came the high spot, literally. The performance of the Norwich City Waits. The Waits were 5 musicians who were retained by the civic authorities for precisely this sort of occasion. Although I'll put money on the fact they'd never done a gig this important before. The crowds were jostling all around this building on the marketplace, the Guildhall. And that's why they were sent out onto the roof to perform for the Queen and her subjects. So you see, the Beatles weren't the first ones to do a rooftop gig. The Norwich City Waits were there 500 years before them. At 6 shillings a man a day, the Waits were not cheap, but they were good. So much so that Francis Drake booked them specially for his attack on Portugal. Not their best booking. His expedition was an unmitigated disaster, and even the Waits couldn't rescue the morale of Drake's defeated troops. Unfortunately for the City Waits, they set off with thousands of other young men full of hope and expectation and excitement for this great adventure. And within a few months, all their dreams and hopes were shattered. Along with 20,000 others, 3 of the Waits died of hunger and disease. Perhaps they were philosophical. After pleasure came pain. Well, Norwich knew all about that. Here in the Guildhall, 6 months after the joy of the Queen's visit, the city's rulers were fighting for its life as plague raged through its streets. The Mayor's minute books detail the desperate struggle to contain a catastrophe that was far beyond their comprehension. The city was sealed off to keep out further infection. Convinced that they were spreading the contagion, all animals were slaughtered, everything except the real culprits, the rats. Searchers and keepers controlled the comings and goings of infected persons, but when that failed, in utter desperation and despair, they took the final step. Can you imagine what that must have been like? To know that you were to be shuttered up until the infection had run its course? Every single blow of that hammer must have sounded like the angel of death hammering on your door. All you could do now was wait and pray. The plague hit hardest in the poorest areas of the city. In the heat of the summer, that was when it was at its worst. And that was when the authorities were desperate to make sure that they could get the infected corpses quickly and safely underground. So they appointed corpse carriers. You could always recognize the corpse carriers. They were ordered to carry red sticks or wands so that people would know that they were the men who carried the infected corpses to the plague pits. Carried them there at 6pence the corpse. It was highly dangerous but highly lucrative employment, provided Black Death didn't reach out and drag you down into the grave with your wages still in your pocket. These men became outcasts within their own stricken city, men at the edges of a crumbling society, and it was to the edge of the city that they were banished, to the Black Tower on Carrow Hill. The men who took the plague-ridden corpses to the graveside were forced to live here as a small community in what amounted to an old-style medieval pest house. The black, napped flints gave the tower its name, but it was the plague that gave it its history. Elizabeth's court was haunted by the spectre of plague. That's why her summer progress has brought her to places like Hengrave Hall, as far as she could possibly get from the cities, where the hot months could easily produce a catastrophic contagion. And in the hopes that she'd honour them with a royal visit, many a courtier and gentleman built prodigy houses, pocket palaces with every luxury and convenience imaginable, including lavish entertainments. At Hengrave, it was a play, the answer to our riddle: who was away with the fairies? The subject of that evening's entertainment? Well, it was one dear to the hearts of all Elizabethans. Why do you think Shakespeare wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream? It was all about fairies.